After surviving a devastating car crash in Seattle, freelance photographer Harper Evans wakes to find herself half paralyzed and utterly alone, except for Quinn Miles, the calm, enigmatic night shift nurse who refuses to leave her side. I don't remember the collision, only the shriek of twisting metal, a flash of blinding headlights, then a silence so total it felt like the world had swallowed me. When awareness finally clawed its way back, fluorescent panels glared overhead. 4 tubes tugged at my veins, and my left leg was cocooned in plaster from thigh to ankle. The sharpest pain, though, bloomed somewhere behind my eyes. A silhouette leaned over me. Midnight blue scrubs, name badge catching the light. Quinn Miles, RN. Her auburn hair was knotted into a tidy bun, wisps curling at her temples from the humidity of the ward. "You're safe, Harper. I'm here." The softness in her voice slid past the morphine haze and anchored me to the bed. Before I could reply, exhaustion dragged me under again. Night bled into dawn. Machines hummed like somber insects. Rain tapped against the glass of the 6th floor trauma unit. Each time consciousness resurfaced, Quinn was there, adjusting a monitor, smoothing the rumpled hospital blanket over my shoulders, asking gentle questions that required only a nod. She smelled faintly of peppermint and the sterile powder of latex gloves. By the 3rd day, the fog in my skull began to lift. With clarity came embarrassment. Hair matted with dried blood, breath rancid from hours of silence, a body wired to beeping satellites. Yet Quinn never flinched. "What did you dream about last night?" she asked while checking the dressings on my arm. "A forest," I rasped. "Everything was green and I could run without falling." "You'll run again," she promised, not with a bland nurse's optimism but with a certainty that made my lungs tremble. Physical pain receded, replaced by a need I'd never felt so acutely, an ache for her presence. When her shift ended at 7 a.m., daylight suddenly felt too harsh. I started counting seconds until 11 p.m. when she would glide back through the door, coffee thermos in hand, whispering, "Hey, warrior, still with me?" On the 7th morning, I woke to unfamiliar hands rolling my wheelchair toward the rehab gym. Marcus, the day nurse, offered polite encouragement, but Quinn's absence thudded in my chest harder than the therapy stairs beneath my useless foot. Muscles screamed, my mood soured. Where was she? Hours dragged. Afternoon light faded into the steel-gray drizzle of a Seattle winter evening, and still no sign of midnight blue scrubs. I told myself nurses rotated. I told myself attachment was foolish. Yet by lights out my pulse skittered every time footsteps passed the doorway, and crashed when they kept going. 2nd day without Quinn. My therapist applauded a shaky lap with crutches, yet happiness tasted flat. Lunch congealed untouched. I stared at the clock until its red digits blurred. That night I dreamed of forests again, but this time the trees were stripped bare, branches clutching at a sky the color of antiseptic. Morning of day 3. Rain hammered the roof like distant applause mocking my disappointment. No Quinn. I pressed the call button just to hear a voice, any voice, but the person who answered wasn't hers. By the 4th evening, anxiety chiseled at the edges of my composure. Had I imagined the warmth in her eyes? Invented the way her fingers lingered an extra heartbeat over mine? Perhaps I was only another chart to her, another broken body to patch and pass along. As dusk slid toward midnight, I sat alone by the window, wheelchair parked so I could watch headlights smear across wet asphalt far below. I tried to rehearse gratitude for survival, yet every memory of squealing tires was overlaid by the memory of Quinn whispering, "You're safe." Sudden click. The door eased open, letting in a sliver of corridor light, and the unmistakable outline of midnight blue scrubs. I sucked in a breath that tasted like relief and fear all at once. "Harper," she said, voice hushed, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I'm sorry I was gone." My heart hammered. Questions crowded my throat, but only one emerged. "Why did you stay away?" Quinn stepped inside, shutting the door behind her with a soft latch. In her hands were 2 steaming paper cups. She crossed the room, offering one to me. "I brought coffee," she whispered. "Can we talk?" My fingers trembled around the cardboard sleeve, half from weakness, half from the electricity buzzing in the quiet air between us. And there, on a rain-lashed night high above the city streets, the fragile world I'd rebuilt in her absence tilted on its axis. Quinn set the second cup on the tray table and perched on the edge of my bed, the soft mattress dipping toward her like a magnet. Steam unfurled between us, carrying the faint scent of hazelnut. For a moment we just listened to the rain gnawing at the window, matching the thrum in my pulse. When she finally spoke, her voice was raw, as though every word traveled a long, torn road before leaving her throat. She told me her wife's name, Amelia, and how the night after our terrace conversation Amelia had stumbled across Quinn's forgotten notebook, pages filled with vital signs and stray thoughts. In the margins, beside my blood pressure numbers, Quinn had been sketching snippets of our conversations. Forest dreams, peppermint evenings, the exact angle my smile took when I tasted coffee again. Amelia confronted her, not with anger but with aching worry, and Quinn discovered that honesty could wound just as sharply as lies. "I thought distance might kill whatever I was feeling," she whispered. "Instead it only mapped the edges of it." As she spoke, an odd clarity settled over me. The crash had sheared away chunks of my memory, but it had also carved space for new truth. Quinn wasn't fearless. She was simply braver than the doubts that hunted her. I realized I didn't want her to shoulder that bravery alone. I set my cup down, curled my fingers around hers, and felt the fine tremor running beneath the surface of her composure. The following mornings became exercises in restraint. Quinn still worked nights. I endured therapy during the daylight, pushing a clunky walker down antiseptic corridors that smelled of detergent and thawing grief. With every painful step I heard Marcus cheering, but in my head rang Quinn's promise. "You'll run again." I pictured her hands hovering at my waist, steady but never possessive, and the image fueled another half-meter forward. By afternoon I was an exhausted knot of muscles, yet dusk carried its own electricity because dusk meant Quinn would soon glide back through the door. We created rituals to camouflage what bloomed between us. She diagrammed my progress on a whiteboard. Number of steps, degree of knee flexion, pain scale, faces smirking or frowning. I responded with photographs taken on my phone, close-ups of hospital textures, cracked vinyl armrests, beaded 4 lines catching lamplight like rain on power lines. I sent them to her work email with caption prompts. "What does this remind you of?" And she replied during breaks. "A winter highway. Silver ripples across a lake." It was nothing, and it was everything. A silent cipher wrapped inside professional courtesy. One night she wheeled me to radiology for another round of scans. The corridor lights buzzed, flickering a heartbeat faster than reality. And somewhere down the hall an orderly whistled Sinatra off-key. As the elevator doors closed, Quinn exhaled as though she had been holding her breath for days. The steel box felt too small for the storm inside us. She stared at her reflection in the mirrored panel, cheeks hollow from overtime, freckles muted beneath fatigue, and murmured, "Sometimes I'm afraid you confuse gratitude with something bigger." I met her eyes in the glass, those storm-gray irises that had anchored me to this world, and answered, "Gratitude keeps you alive. Love makes you want to live." Her shoulders trembled, and I knew the line between the two had become impossible to trace. January thaw crept over Seattle, dripping ice into gutters outside the rehab gym. My leg graduated from cast to hinged brace, and I relearned weight distribution like a newborn deer. Knees knocking, pride bruised. Each minor triumph, 5 unbroken steps, the first stair conquered, sent a message to Quinn across the hospital's hidden channels. She intercepted it in passing glances and midnight chart notes. In return she smuggled me tiny comforts, stolen packets of cinnamon sugar for my bland oatmeal, earbuds charred with her playlist of melancholy indie folk, a lavender eye mask that smelled faintly of her perfume. Yet reality leaked through the seams. One evening as she guided me back from the therapy pool, someone called her name. A petite woman in a mustard yellow raincoat stood near the pharmacy window, dark curls frizzing in the humidity. Quinn's breath caught. My walker lurched sideways. The woman's gaze shifted from Quinn to me, bandaged, trembling, and understanding flared in her eyes like a struck match. She offered a polite nod, but pain flickered behind it. Without a word, Quinn shepherded me into the elevator, shoulders rigid with unspoken apology. That night she didn't visit. Absence tasted metallic. I lay awake, replaying the raincoat scene, dissecting every blink, every micro-expression. Guilt coiled in my gut. Jealousy nested beside it. Morning dawned gray. Marcus wheeled in with breakfast and news. Because I'd exceeded mobility targets, discharge was penciled for the end of the week. Celebration should have soared inside me. Instead I felt hollow. Leaving meant freedom, but it also meant no more midnight hazelnut coffees. No more quiet terrace dawns above the city's glinting arteries. 3 nights before discharge, a soft knock broke the hush. Quinn slipped inside, face drawn but resolute. She sat on the edge of the bed, didn't reach for my hand, didn't look away when I studied the red rims of her eyes. "That was Amelia," she began, as if I could have forgotten. "She's my history, my promise," and her voice cracked, "my comfort zone. But you are the part of me I didn't know was starving." Moonlight leaked across the linoleum. It painted her shoulders in silver question marks. I asked quietly, "Does loving me require tearing yourself in half?" She shook her head, braid unraveling against her collar. "No, but choosing only one life does." A gust rattled the loose pane near the ceiling. Somewhere down the hall a call bell chimed, ignored for 2 beats too long. Quinn inhaled, as though the entire wing weighed on her lungs. "I need to know," she whispered. "When you go home, will you remember me as the nurse who patched you up or as the woman who nearly broke you again?" I reached out then, palm resting over the pulse at her wrist, felt it race like a trapped hummingbird. "I'll remember you," I said, "as the storm that taught me how to rebuild." She closed her eyes, let a single tear slip past lashes. Then, deliberate, trembling, she kissed my forehead. Not the hungry collision of our first forbidden kiss, but something gentler, sealing a letter she wasn't allowed to mail. When she straightened, resolve had replaced sorrow. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll walk you across the unit without the walker. You'll use a cane. And the day after, you'll climb the therapy stairs alone. When you leave, you'll carry your future in both hands, steady." I swallowed the lump in my throat, nodded. I almost told her that her faith was my miracle drug, but the words felt flimsy compared with the truth blazing in the space between us. She brushed a strand of wet hair from my temple, then slipped from the room before I could ask her to stay. The door clicked shut, leaving the scent of peppermint and rain. I stared at the ceiling tiles until dawn, rehearsing goodbye speeches that shattered every time I imagined her mouth forming the word farewell. 2 days left. The clock was a relentless drummer. Therapy blurred into a montage. Cane tapping, sweat slick on my spine, Quinn's encouraging nod from the doorway, although she carefully kept her distance. Each night I half expected her to appear again. Each night she didn't, and the ache became something sharp enough to etch my name into the bed rails. On the eve of discharge, Marcus wheeled my suitcase into the corner. Quinn nowhere in sight. My chest folded inward. Maybe the silent kiss had been her curtain call. Responsibility fulfilled, heart safeguarded. Yet as the evening shift ended, I heard the familiar creak of my door. She stepped in wearing civilian clothes. Dark jeans, navy wool coat, hair undone and tumbling over her shoulders like burnt copper. In her hands, a camera, vintage Nikon wrapped in gauze white ribbon. "I found it at a thrift shop," she said, voice barely more than breath. "It's old, reliable, maybe a little bruised, kind of like someone I know." I loaded black and white film. "You said once the world feels clearer without color." She placed the camera on my lap, fingers lingering just long enough to send sparks dancing through my veins. I stared at the gift, throat thick. Before I could fashion gratitude into sentences, she turned away, fingers tightening around the door handle. Over her shoulder she murmured, "Take pictures, Harper. Collect proof you kept living." Then she slipped into the corridor, her silhouette swallowed by fluorescent haze. I wanted to call after her, nail her name to the air so it couldn't vanish. But the word snagged behind my teeth, a butterfly pinned there, fluttering. I cradled the camera instead, feeling its cool weight, and understood that some love stories aren't novels. They're contact prints, seared in silver halide, fragile yet indelible. Tomorrow I'd walk out on my own legs, load the shutter, and aim at a horizon Quinn might never share. Yet every frame would carry echo traces of midnight blue scrubs and hazelnut steam, of the nurse who taught a broken stranger how to map the path home through darkness. Winter loosened its grip on Seattle the way a fist relaxes after too long in anger, slowly with lingering tremors. On the first morning outside the hospital, I discovered the ordinary world felt strangely altered, as if someone had nudged every building half a degree askew. Crossing my apartment threshold with a cane instead of a wheelchair should have tasted like victory, but the hush inside those familiar walls rang hollow. Pill bottles lined the counter like chess pieces awaiting orders. Laundry hung in limp surrender over the back of a chair, and in the center of the living room, Quinn's thrift store Nikon sat on the coffee table, ribbons still knotted around the lens cap like a promise I was too afraid to untie. Rehab moved to an outpatient clinic nestled between a bakery and a tattoo parlor on Pike Street. Twice a week I limped through the door smelling sugar and ink, climbed a staircase that snarled beneath my brace, and surrendered to resistance bands and balance boards. I was the only patient under 50, yet I carried the heaviest silence. My therapist, Rosa, encouraged small talk, weekend plans, local sports, but every question felt like an invitation to mention Quinn, so I answered with weather observations instead. Evenings blurred into an ache of absence. I brewed hazelnut coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink, letting the steam feather my face the way Quinn's breath once warmed my cheek. I thumbed through the camera manual, learning aperture from shutter speed, depth of field from focal length, anything to distract myself from the ghost of midnight blue scrubs haunting my peripheral vision. When insomnia pressed too hard, I roamed the city on aching legs, documenting the way neon reflected in puddles, how streetlight halos crowned strangers hurrying past. Each click of the shutter sounded like Quinn whispering, "Take pictures, Harper. Collect proof you kept living." Week 3 post-discharge. An email appeared from an address I didn't recognize. Subject line: "One more terrace above the city." My pulse ricocheted. The message itself was a single line of text. Saturday, 7 p.m., roof of the Fry building. "I'll bring the coffee," signed simply Q. No apology, no justification, just coordinates in space and time. I read it twice, closed the laptop, then reopened it to be sure the words hadn't evaporated. They hadn't. Saturday arrived wrapped in a damp marine layer. I almost convinced myself not to go, almost chose safety over wanting. But as dusk bruised the horizon, I found myself hobbling into the lobby of the Fry Medical Research Center, heart beating a frantic Morse code beneath my coat. The elevator smelled of disinfectant and worn carpet. Its ascent felt steeper than any therapy stair. When the doors parted, wind slapped my cheeks, cold and exhilarating. Quinn stood by the parapet, hair loose, coat unbuttoned despite the chill. 2 paper cups steamed beside her on the ledge. My cane clicked against concrete. The sound turned her around. For a heartbeat we said nothing. City lights glittered below, mapping arteries of red and gold through wet streets. Then she picked up 1 cup, crossed to me and held it out. "Hazelnut, course." She spoke first, voice subdued but steady. Amelia had moved out 3 days after our last hospital encounter. No fireworks, no accusations, just a suitcase rolling over hardwood and the quiet surrender of shared keys. She said she needed to remember who she was before I started vanishing on her, Quinn admitted, fingers tightening around her cup. I didn't fight. Couldn't promise her I'd stop thinking about you. I absorbed the confession like a bruise takes color, spreading slow, impossible to hide. Guilt tangled with relief, then with a fierce, irrational joy. Wind tore the breath from my lungs. Or maybe it was her nearness. I asked what she wanted now, afraid of both answers, me or not me. She didn't answer immediately. Instead she reached for the camera hanging from my neck and lifted it gently, as though touching an animal that might bolt. She raised it, framed me against the skyline, and pressed the shutter. The click echoed in the hollow of my ribs. "I want that," she whispered. "Moments that prove we existed." We walked the perimeter once, my cane tapping rhythm while she matched my slower pace. Every few yards she paused, capturing slices of night. The crooked lightning scar on my calf where stitches once bit, the reflection of traffic in the brass buttons on her coat. Her shadow overlapping mine like a Venn diagram of something that might become whole. Conversation trickled out in fragments. Her fear of failing everyone, my terror that the future still contained oncoming headlights. Neither of us offered solutions. We simply folded our vulnerabilities side by side like blankets shared for warmth. Before parting, Quinn glanced at my leg brace, then at the stairwell door. "Can you trust me?" she asked. I nodded before rational thought intervened. She stepped behind me, hands hovering near my hips, and guided me down the first flight, then the second. Each step burned, muscles trembling, but her voice, soft, steady, became a metronome syncing my scattered heartbeats. At the bottom landing she hugged me from behind, forehead resting between my shoulder blades. "You climbed higher than you fell," she murmured. In that echoing concrete shaft, it felt like a benediction. Back on the street, mist haloed every street lamp. Quinn hailed a rideshare for me, scribbled something on the back of her hospital ID badge, and pressed it into my palm. "Call when you're ready," she said before the car swallowed her silhouette. Inside the badge sleeve I found a Polaroid she'd taken on the roof. Me framed by city lights, wind-tousled hair half covering my grin. On the lower border she'd written, "Proof number 1. Days clicked forward. Therapy milestones ticked by. Brace set aside for a neoprene sleeve. Cane traded for a hesitant stride." Each success begged to be shared, and sometimes I texted Quinn progress photos. An empty cane propped against a bench, a time-lapse of my feet in motion. Her replies arrived at odd hours. A thumbs-up emoji, a gif of fireworks, a voice memo whispering "proud of you, warrior." Yet between messages stretched stretches of silence thick as storm clouds. I suspected hospital overtime, court paperwork, late-night arguments with the echo of Amelia's absence. My chest knotted with worry. I had appended her life only to offer uncertainty in return. So I poured energy into photographs. Abandoned piers dripping with moss, elderly couples holding hands outside grocery stores, schoolgirls splashing through puddles. I printed the best 16, tacked them in a grid across my blank bedroom wall, and labeled the collection proof we kept living. The empty 17th slot waited like an unanswered question. Rain relinquished the city to spring. One Friday Rosa dismissed me from formal rehab with a certificate printed on cheap cardstock. "Your gate's awkward but yours," she laughed. "Go test it somewhere beautiful." That night I wandered to Gasworks Park, tripod slung over my shoulder. The skyline glittered across Lake Union, and I framed a long exposure shot. Clouds streaking water smoothing into molten glass, reflections blurring the boundary between earth and sky. Just before the shutter closed, a figure stepped beside me, silhouette etched by distant neon. Quinn. No scrubs, no coat. Just jeans, a slate-gray hoodie, and eyes reflecting city lights. I didn't ask how she found me. Intuition felt explanation enough. She slipped her hand into mine, thumb tracing the callus forming where the cane had rubbed raw. We watched the camera's red tally light blink down to 0, capturing a photograph layered with coincidence and intent. When the exposure finished, she spoke without looking away from the viewfinder. "Amelia filed divorce papers." The words floated across the dark water, rippling the air between us. "She said love shouldn't feel like sharing organs. She wants us both to breathe again." A gull cried overhead. Traffic hummed beyond the hill. Inside my chest something unfolded that had been clenched since headlights met my windshield months ago. I asked Quinn what she wanted, truly, fiercely. She turned then, city glow carving gentle hollows beneath her cheekbones. "To learn the shape of us without borrowed time," she answered. "Coffee that's not stolen from the staff lounge, walks that don't end at a discharge desk, kisses that don't taste like goodbye." I reached for her waist, steady on my own 2 feet, grounding us to the damp grass. Our mouths met, slow, conscious, unhidden. No terraced rooftop, no fluorescent corridor. Just open sky and the promise of dawn brewing beyond the Cascades. When we parted, she pressed her forehead to mine. "One day at a time," she murmured. I nodded, feeling the camera strap burn a hopeful line across my neck. Later, as moonlight silvered the lake, Quinn helped me pack equipment, then walked me to the parking lot. Before closing my car door, she placed a second Polaroid in my hand. The long exposure skyline smeared into dream colors, our silhouettes anchoring the foreground. On its white border she'd written, "Proof number 17. My collection complete." I drove home with windows cracked, cool night air tangling through hair still scented of her shampoo. Traffic lights blurred into a rhythm that felt like possibility. Back in my apartment, I slid Polaroid number 17 into the final slot on the wall. Under the full grid, I taped the rehab certificate, laughing at its flimsy grandeur. The wall looked like a map of places pain had carried me, and where love might lead next. Outside, rain returned, soft as a lullaby. I brewed hazelnut coffee, this time drinking every warm swallow, and envisioned tomorrow. Therapy cancelled, legs strong enough for fairy decks and farmers markets, Quinn's laughter echoing off restaurant brick. There were still signatures to finalize, secrets to unwrap, ghosts to lay gently to rest. But for the first time since twisting metal carved silence into my life, the space between heartbeats felt wide enough to house a future. Summer draped Seattle in soft gold, the kind of light that slips through blinds like a private invitation. 3 months had passed since the night Quinn placed Polaroid number 17 in my hand, and those months felt both blisteringly fast and stubbornly slow, as if time kept checking over its shoulder to be sure we were still following. My leg brace lived in the closet now, wedged behind a tripod case, and the cane leaned unused against the fridge, gathering grocery lists instead of fingerprints. Most mornings began with Quinn humming off-key in my shower. She'd kept her apartment but rarely slept there, and ended with us sprawled on my living room floor, editing photographs until sunrise bullied the stars away. Life, however, insisted on testing the seam strength of our new shape. The hospital's ethics committee opened a file on Quinn after an anonymous complaint, likely a colleague who'd glimpsed one rooftop coffee too many. She sat through interviews beneath flickering office fluorescents, hands folded so tightly the knuckles blanched, admitting only that she and a former patient were now personally connected. They offered her a choice: written censure and a probation period, or resignation with a neutral letter of reference. She came home that evening smelling like stale photocopier ink, dropped the envelope on the kitchen table and said, "I can't keep healing people in a place that thinks love is contamination." Her voice didn't tremble, but her shoulders did. I wrapped her in my arms and felt the weight of decisions settle against my ribs. Quinn filed the resignation the next morning. Amelia's final papers arrived a week later. No alimony requested, just signatures dissolving vows like sugar in coffee. The same day, Rosa forwarded me an email from a downtown gallery seeking emerging photographers for a charity exhibit titled Reclamation. The theme, transformation after trauma, felt carved from my bones. I submitted the wall of 17 proofs, adding a silent 18th frame. An empty hospital bed washed in half-light, pillows still dented where Quinn's head once rested during those forbidden nights. 2 days later the curator called, voice thrumming with excitement, and offered me the show's closing slot. Preparation consumed us. Quinn found work at a free clinic on Capitol Hill. Lower pay, longer hours, but a mission stitched from hope rather than bureaucracy. She spent evenings cataloging vaccines and charting blood pressure spikes while I calibrated printers, mat boards, and mounting tape. We shared headphones across the tiny kitchen table, her laptop blipping with patient emails as my monitor glowed with histograms. Sometimes we forgot to eat until midnight. Sometimes we burned grilled cheese sandwiches and laughed so hard the smoke alarm scolded us into hunger. August arrived with the scent of sun-warmed asphalt and blackberries over-ripening in alleyway thickets. On opening night, the gallery's white walls gleamed like freshly bandaged skin. The curator positioned my series in a quiet side room to encourage reflection. Visitors drifted through, wine glasses tilting toward the floor as they leaned closer to read the handwritten captions beneath each frame. Proof number 1. Survival, proof number 7. Hope, proof number 17, choice. Polaroid number 18 hung last. Untitled. People stared at the vacant bed, then at the earlier shots of hospital hallways and rooftop skylines, and their silence felt reverent rather than puzzled. Quinn hovered near the doorway, a linen dress the color of sea glass brushing her calves, hair swept into a messy braid that still released strands for me to tuck back in place. She was nervous, worried that someone would recognize her, worried she'd distract from the art, worried I'd regret making our private story communal. I took her hand and guided her to stand beneath proof number 5, the one where a single peppermint candy sits on a crumpled pillowcase like a beacon. Every image needs its truth beside it, I whispered. You're mine. She squeezed my fingers, eyes glistening, and the knot in my stomach loosened. Near closing time, an elderly woman approached, cane tapping a tattoo across the hardwood. She studied the wall, then turned to me. People think healing is a straight line, she said, voice soft as paper maps. Your pictures show the switchbacks. She patted the camera hanging from my neck. Keep tracing them. Some of us are still lost. She shuffled away before I could thank her, leaving behind the sweet sting of recognition. 2 weeks later we drove east toward the Cascades, my first long trip since the crash. Quinn's muddy Honda rattled like a tin toy over mountain switchbacks, trunk filled with leftover prints and a picnic cooler. We parked at the trailhead of a forest I'd once only dreamed about, the same one I had described from my hospital bed. Cedar and hemlock tangled overhead, and the air tasted of sap and river spray. I hesitated at the path, memory of sirens echoing faintly, but Quinn slipped her hand against the small of my back. We'll go slow, she promised. We didn't go slow. We went exactly the pace my muscles could carry, which to my shock was nearly as fast as hers. Roots snagged my boot treads, rocks threatened to wobble ankles, yet my leg held sturdy and forgiving. At the 2-mile mark we reached a clearing where August wildflowers fluttered like colored handkerchiefs against moss-dark earth. The valley yawned open below, a river ribboning silver between pines. I set up the tripod, framing Quinn's profile against a sky bruised purple by late afternoon. As the shutter clicked, she spun toward me. I miss my patients already, she said, startling me. But I don't miss hiding. She exhaled, drawing the smell of damp leaves into her lungs. Maybe healing isn't a place. Maybe it's a language we teach each other. I pressed the remote shutter again, capturing her mid-sentence, eyes bright, mouth brave. Then she took the camera, turned it on me, and whispered, "Run." I laughed, a short bark of disbelief, but she stepped back, lifted the lens. My heart slammed the inside of my sternum. I shifted weight onto my left foot, the one surgeons had patched with screws and stubborn optimism, and jogged 3 paces across the meadow, each step a tiny leap of faith. Pain zinged but did not conquer. Quinn's whoop echoed off the ridge. I kept going, knees pumping, lungs raw with triumph, until gravity insisted I slow. When I stopped, bent double, tears clogged my vision, but the grin cut through. Quinn jogged to me, breath hitching with pride. "That was 10 seconds, she gasped. 10 whole seconds. She pressed her forehead to mine, camera still dangling from her wrist. "Proof number 19, she whispered. I wrapped arms around her damp shoulders, feeling her pulse drumming against mine. And for the first time since screeching metal erased my old life, my body and future inhabited the same moment. We hiked back at dusk, fireflies. It turns out Washington has them now, scribbling neon signatures in the underbrush. At the trailhead, Quinn stopped, rooted me with a look as steady as any 4-line. "I love you," she said. First time spoken aloud, neither of us startled by its inevitability. I answered by kissing her, the taste of wild mint lingering on her lips. Behind us, the forest murmured approval. In September, the clinic promoted Quinn to program coordinator. I took a contract shooting recovery stories for a non-profit magazine, following veterans through adaptive sports programs, documenting families rebuilding after wildfire. Every assignment felt like a branch grafted onto the same tree. Survival, resilience, the geometry of second chances. Nights we crashed on the couch, comparing scar tissue of the past day. Hers bruises from flu shot lines, mine sunburn from fieldwork. We argued over whose turn it was to buy coffee beans, over which song belonged at the top of the road trip playlist, over whether peanut butter counts as dinner. We resolved each argument with laughter or apologies, or sometimes quietly holding each other until the edge wore off. One rainy Tuesday, I added 2 shelves above the desk and lined them with small black frames. Proof number 20 showed Quinn teaching a child to wrap a blood pressure cuff around a teddy bear. Proof number 21 caught me ankle-deep in river water, photographing salmon surging upstream. We kept numbering each new evidence photograph, affixing captions in messily handwritten Sharpie. Proof number 28. Stayed. Proof number 34. Grew. Proof number 41. Forgave. The wall filled until it resembled a mosaic of breath. On the anniversary of the crash, we drove to the site, a mundane intersection now free of wreckage. Quinn insisted we bring flowers, not as a shrine to pain but as a marker where one story ended and another began. We laid the bouquet on a low brick wall, stems bright against damp mortar. I lifted the camera, intending one solemn frame, but Quinn stepped into the shot, tugged me beside her and beamed. The shutter captured our reflection in a puddle, 2 women leaning toward each other, rain stippling their jackets, both alive beyond reasonable odds. Back home, I printed the image and slipped it into a new frame. Underneath I wrote, Proof number 52, lived. I hung it in the last uncluttered corner of the hallway, and for once the hammer strike didn't echo like memory. It rang like a starting bell. That night Quinn curled against me, tracing the scar on my thigh with a fingertip tender as moonlight. There will be hard days, she murmured, when the committee meetings and flashbacks gang up. I kissed her hairline. Then we'll photograph them, I said. Turn them into evidence we made it through. She smiled against my collarbone and whispered, Keep the shutter ready. Outside, autumn's first wind rattled leaves across asphalt, but inside the apartment the air was steady, the quiet of 2 hearts learning a fluency only they could speak. And as sleep drifted over us, I dreamt not of collisions or hospital corridors, but of clear trails through evergreen shadows, of camera shutters and hazelnut steam, of a nurse and a patient who renamed their wounds until every scar answered to hope.